Hello, everyone. So in today's YouTube video, I'm going to be talking about an application of the content that we've learned in Unit 4, specifically to the minimum wage debate. And so we're going to find how we can tweak the market setting of a labor market and come up with sort of different conclusions, both positive and normative, about minimum wage law. Okay, so first I just want to review. We had talked specifically about, or not specific, I don't know why I use specifically so often, but we have talked a great deal about consumer and producer surplus in this class. And we said that this is going to be a tool that we can use to sort of think about the welfare implications of markets. It's not always a foolproof tool, but nonetheless, it's an important tool for thinking about welfare implications of markets. All right, so we have here the consumer and producer surplus associated with what I'm going to call a low-skilled labor market. And remember, labor markets are a little bit more counterintuitive. When we talked about input markets specifically in Year 5, we said it really just goes over all the other material that we've developed throughout this course, but there's a bit of a twist. And in this case, the workers are the suppliers of labor and the demanders of labor are businesses. Right? Of course, we conventionally think of businesses and firms as being producers, but in this example, they are going to be the demanders of labor. And we said, assuming a perfectly competitive market equilibrium, that leaving the market alone, or a perfectly competitive labor market or perfectly competitive market, leaving the market alone, leaving the market to its own devices, well, actually, not just assuming a perfectly competitive market, but also, ignoring market failure for a moment. Well, I guess that's just an identity issue. Whatever. But the first theorem of welfare economics is that markets are these allocatively efficient mechanisms, right? And if we assume perfect competition, that the equilibrium quantity that we're going to arrive at in a market is going to be the allocatively efficient, or the equilibrium point is going to represent the allocatively efficient price and quantity. We're going to achieve allocative efficiency. And what we mean by this is quantity supplied equals quantity demand at this point. And so this means that there's going to be the people that are going to, the businesses that are going to demand labor, that are going to enter the labor market and acquire labor, are going to be the ones that value it at or above the price, right? Now, we found out that there can be situations in which we disrupt market equilibrium for whatever reason, where we're no longer producing, or there's a gap between the it creates either a gap between the quantity demanded or the quantity supplied. Or we're going to see in a bit, or let me just start with the example, right? If we throw in a price, a binding price floor, I often try to delay the inevitable to kind of build suspense, but I mean, I'm a teacher, I'm not, trying to sort of run an exciting film. But if we have a binding price floor, as we do here, we can see we create a situation in which there's a gap between quantity demanded and quantity supplied, and we're obviously, the quantity that is supplied to them, or the quantity that gets exchanged in the market is obviously going to be the lower quantity right here, is not going to be at allocative efficiency, meaning that there is going to be firms there's going to be workers, obviously, that are not able to acquire work, right? And so we show this as newly unemployed people, right? This gap between quantity demanded and quantity supplied. So we said, markets can be these great things because they're these mechanisms that create this allocative, or they drive production towards this allocatively efficient point, assuming perfect competition, which comes with its own unique conditions, like perfect information about prices. It doesn't necessarily need to come with identical sellers, but it does come with the provision that there needs to be identical products that are being sold and exchanged. So similar workers, or identical workers in this case, that we can arrive at an allocatively efficient equilibrium, right? We also said that this, leaving this market alone, right, we're going to arrive at the point at which social welfare is most maximized, right? Social surplus being the sum of consumer and producer surplus. All government can do, a sort of boogeyman in some sense, assuming this sort of market setting, right, this market setting of perfect competition, right, and this has implications for the individual firm, right? What we mean by this market setting of perfect competition in labor markets specifically is that the supply of labor, as we can see here, is going to be perfectly elastic because you can't raise the wage, right? If you raise the wage, then you're attracting all these workers and producing well above marginal or your marginal cost is well above your revenue. So you wouldn't do that, right? But at the same time, too, you can't acquire workers for a lower wage because they would just go to a different firm. So that we have a perfectly elastic supply curve. And this supply curve is also the wage and the marginal factor cost curve that has zero slope, right? And the demand curve, which we can think of as like a marginal benefit curve, the additional benefit associated with an additional acquisition of a good or service, in this case, an additional unit of labor. A demand curve for a firm or in a market specifically of labor is going to be the marginal revenue product of labor, the marginal revenue times the marginal product of that labor. Okay. And so this is a very extreme market condition, right? And we can see that the minimum wage has distortionary effects. All we did is we saw that producer surplus gained at the expense of consumer surplus, and maybe we're okay with this, even though we're no longer producing at the allocatively efficient point, because maybe we think that you know, producers are really these people that are incredibly wealthy. I'm sorry, consumers are these people that are incredibly wealthy, and so producers getting some of that surplus is for the best. But I think for the most part, a lot of us saw this as potentially being a negative story in terms of government intervention. You don't necessarily have to see it that way, but it seems like we have newly unemployed people, we have a reduction in social welfare, and we demonstrate that reduction, that efficiency loss, these market transactions that are no longer taking place, but would have taken place otherwise, as this shaded triangle, which is dead-weight loss. Right? So we see the effects of that minimum wage. And all this market setting of a perfectly competitive input market is incredibly extreme. We can nonetheless develop use this to develop our intuition about maybe the potential trade-offs that we would expect to face as we increase the minimum wage. Right, and certainly there's a lot of people that argue we shouldn't increase the minimum wage because it will lead to greater unemployment among low-skilled workers, or potentially, you know, firms are already struggling, and you know, some firms may potentially go out of business because it would effectively increase the marginal cost of production for firms. But again, this is one market setting. And then we said that if we complicated it, and if we realized that this perfectly competitive labor market setting, it's really doing a lot of work, right? Labor markets are not perfectly competitive. It's not very clear, you know, all the time. Or I don't think, you know, even if a worker knew or had knowledge, perfect knowledge about the wages that existed and salaries that existed in society, they wouldn't necessarily be able to cautiously transition to that new work or so forth. Maybe they have social ties or commitments, or maybe that higher wage or higher salaries in another part of the country, or maybe it comes with a higher wage or higher salary, but there's other costs that you need to consider, like the cost of living, and it's hard for people in the real world to make these sort of cost-benefit analysis, this marginal analysis. And so the imperfectly competitive model, so I think it's safe to say that labor markets are imperfectly competitive, but now we need to ask the question, to what extent, right? So if the monopsony model, a situation in which there's only one buyer of labor, can help us develop, again, our intuition about the range of possibility that exists between the monopsony model and the perfectly competitive input market, right? And therefore kind of think about the potential effects, or what we need to look for to determine whether a minimum wage would actually be a smart idea or a bad idea. And so in the monopsony model, we have an upward sloping supply curve, which is different than for a firm before. We have a market supply curves are usually are upward sloping usually in the short run, and they can actually in a perfectly competitive world, and they can actually still be upward sloping in the long run in a perfectly competitive world. But we assume that a single firm has a perfectly elastic supply curve in a perfectly competitive input market, right? But in this case, since the firm owns the whole market, they have an upward sloping supply curve, reflecting this idea for the firm to get more and more laborers working, they need to charge a higher wage. And then we see the demand curve right here. The demand curve is represented by the marginal revenue product of labor, or the marginal benefit, the additional benefit associated with additional units of labor, or we can think of it as a rate of change as well. And then we have an upward sloping supply curve. And unlike before, where the supply curve and the marginal factor curve were, for a single firm, the same thing, and it was perfectly elastic, if you own the market, the marginal factor curve for you is going to be rise at twice the rate of the supply curve, assuming they're both lines and not curves, right? I can do a math example of why that is, but let's just try to develop our thinking about why that is. Well, if you wanted to produce, Q units of labor, you have to charge it this wage, and if you wanted to acquire this units of labor, you have to offer that wage, but you have to offer that wage on the laborers before too, because otherwise they're going to get upset, right? So you have to offer, as you're acquiring more and more workers, there's this sort of reverse poisoning effect. Remember we talked about a poisoning effect in the monopoly model. There's this sort of poisoning effect that exists here in the monopsony model, in the sense that to acquire additional units of labor, you have to raise the wage on all your workers to acquire additional units of labor. And so you face an upward sloping supply curve. And so your marginal costs are going to increase at a faster rate than your supply curve. And your supply curve is going to reflect not your marginal cost curve in this type of market setting, but your average cost curve. We can do an identity maybe later in a mathy example about why that is. So effectively what we get here, the cost minimizing rule probably still holds. The amount of worker that's going to be demanded by this firm is going to be at the intersection of the marginal factor cost curve to the demand curve, and then we go down to the x-axis to determine the quantity of labor, so whatever that Q is, and then we go across from the supply curve to determine the wage, right? So the wage would be W star. And we can see right here the market power that this monopsonist has is their ability to charge a wage that is less than the marginal revenue product of labor, right? So essentially, there's this gap that exists between the value of the worker and the wage paid to the worker, right? So the firm earns surplus on the wage paid to the worker, right? In the perfectly competitive input market, we assume, right, eventually there's going to be zero economic profits for firms, but of course, this firm is just earning surplus on workers and workers galore, right? They're not paying them what the firm values them at, which is at whatever this wage is at this point. It's intersection of the marginal factor cost curve and the demand curve. instead paying them here. So that reflects the market, or the gap between the value of the worker and the wage paid to the worker. And so we can see here in this monopsonist model, the deadweight loss associated with this one buyer is in pink, producer surplus is in blue, consumer surplus is in green. And so this is an example of a market failure, a situation in which leaving the market to its own devices does not produce the social welfare maximizing quantity, right? Allocative efficiency, or the perfectly competitive point of production, would be at this intersection right here. We can see it right here. And we would actually realize that we could actually, if this were a perfectly competitive model, there would be more people working. Okay. So pretty interesting. And so what this does, it's kind of mind-blowing, is that in this type of labor market setting, assuming the government, right, because demand and supply curves aren't just like laying around at the back of an envelope somewhere. You know, there's a fair bit of calculation involved, and so it could be quite difficult work. If you set a minimum wage at the allocatively efficient wage, right, or at the perfectly competitive price, right, the perfectly competitive wage, right, what you would effectively do is you would increase employment, right? And you would do this because essentially what you would be doing is your minimum wage will create a new supply curve, right? A horizontal supply curve, right, with zero slope for all the way until these workers past this point are going to demand to enter this labor market, to stop doing leisure. They're going to demand a higher wage, right? So these workers, your supply curve would be have no slope for quite a bit of time and then rise once the minimum wage was past that, or once the minimum wage was not high enough to attract these workers. And your marginal factor cost curve would do the same thing, right? It would be a horizontal marginal factor cost curve. The change in cost over the change in quantity, again, there would be no slope, there would be no change, it would be constant until, of course, we could draw a dotted line from the point where this curve starts to rise all the way up, and that would be the new marginal factor cost curve. And so we have a new supply curve, a new marginal factor cost curve, a minimum wage, and we see we expanded actually people employed in this market. We've actually raised the wage too. We've redistributed some of the wealth, so to speak. We've given producers, so the workers, more of the surplus that was previously enjoyed by the monopsonists. And so it's an interesting model, right? And so it reflects this idea that with market failures, there's room for policy, there's room for governmental interventions to rectify market failures. Okay, we are done. Okay, hold on, there's one more thing I want to say. Oh yeah, one more complication that we could bring to this model is, remember we said that the supply curve for labor of input markets, it's upward sloping to some extent because of the substitution effect, right? At some point, the opportunity costs associated with leisure becomes prohibitively high, and more people enter the market. But also, too, we can picture the income effect working not in tandem with the substitution effect, but against the substitution effect in some sense, too, because there are workers that are probably just trying to hit a specific take-home pay, and once they do, they want to maybe spend a couple more days on vacation or take some more time off, right? And so if their wages increase, they might exit the labor market. So I guess your homework for you is think about, you know, we assumed a constantly upward sloping supply curve. What would happen if the supply curve were actually backward bending? What would be the implications of policies like minimum wage laws and maybe the monopsony model or the other model? And also think about elasticities, like how would elasticities affect in the monopsony market? I guess that could be another assignment you can do. How would elasticities affect in the monopsony market the gap between the value of the worker and the wage paid to the worker? And how would elasticities affect some of the imperfectly competitive competitive input market, sort of the dead weight loss that you expect, right? If the demand for workers is quite inelastic, what are our expectations about loss in social surplus? If our demand for, or if our supply for labor is very inelastic or elastic, what are our expectations of loss of social surplus as wages increase or fall, or as we institute minimum wage? Okay, have a good day.